I don't know why you called the flop and the turn, to be honest with you. Come on, Dane. Dane will pay me off, though. That's the good news. Pay me, Dana.
I raise.
Jeff raises.
In the hand you just watched, which was from a 2-5-10 cash game, the player with the nut flush showed a distinctive facial expression. As he considered his opponent's bet, and before he eventually raised, his lips were stretched out horizontally. Let's watch that again so you can see what I mean.
Pay me, Dana.
I raise.
In general, stretched out lips, when accompanying a significant bet or raise, will indicate relaxation and a strong hand. What are the reasons for this? Stretched out lips have a generally understood meaning of indicating things like concern, disappointment, and sympathy for someone else's disappointment. It's the kind of look people get when they hear a sad story from someone and say, "That's too bad." As you'd expect, players betting weak hands and bluffs have a motivation to not appear concerned or disappointed, so this type of expression will be more rare from them. Most bluffers will want to wear normal, stoic expressions when betting, and that's what you generally find. Players betting strong hands may have a motivation to appear concerned with or worried about the situation, and that's another reason this can show up from players with strong hands. This video is basically a follow-up to a previous video in this series, which was titled Uncertainty and Concern When Betting. That video looked at some similar facial expressions. This video will go into more depth on this one type of facial expression. Remember that we'll only be examining horizontally stretched out lips in this video. You shouldn't confuse this with other mouth expressions like pursed lips. It's fairly common for players who are bluffing to have pursed, angry lips, so you have to keep these behaviors separate in your mind. We're only talking here about stretched out lips. Another note, the more sad or concerned the facial expression seems, the more likely it'll be to indicate relaxation and a strong hand. The more neutral or ambiguous the expression is, the less likely it will adhere to the general pattern. Okay, let's look at some examples now. I'm going to start with some post-flop examples because post-flop situations will generally be more reliable than pre-flop instances. And that's just because pre-flop bets are generally small and pre-flop hand strength isn't as defined as post-flop hand strength. This next hand is from a 3K buy-in tournament. We'll be watching this same player again, Jeff. In this hand, Jeff turns the nut straight, and he opts to check last to act. Now we'll watch as there's a bet and a raise on the river in front of Jeff.
Is Faraz going to take a stab at this, just to take a stab at it? Of course.
Bet, 16.
And
Raise, 32.
Oh my.
see, this is such a bummer that someone doesn't have a 10.
Just
Right?
10?
Yeah, because then they just,
Bomb off.
Gary, I'm sorry. You don't even have the
Fold.
dummy end. I don't know, what are you thinking about? You don't even have the dummy end of the straight. Are you really thinking of calling this?
What did I miss? Oh, the graphics.
Oh.
The graphics folded, the player did not.
75.
Let's watch it again. Any sort of worried facial expression will tend to make relaxation and strong hands more likely. Here's a hand from a 1-2-5 cash game. We'll be watching this player, Mike. He's 3-bet pre-flop with sevens, and then he flops a set.
Oh, wow. Well, Mike is really happy about his back raise here.
Wow.
He flops top set. Unfortunately for him, Mark and Lou, neither of them have any part of this board. And I wouldn't expect to see either of them continue after this bet here. Mike
That is 75.
puts in another 75 bucks. That's a nice.
Notice after he bets, he has the stretched out lips expression as he looks down. Let's watch that again. I would say that this expression isn't likely to be super reliable just because it was on the more ambiguous side. But still, any stretched out lip movement associated with a bet does increase the chances a player is relaxed. This next hand is from a 2-5 cash game. We'll be watching this player, Jeremy, who hits a full house on the river with his ace-queen. There's already one player who went all in on the flop, so Jeremy will be making a bet into an empty side pot.
His mom lives in the city, so I haven't got a clue, you know. I found my car both times in the city. Two times in the city. Once at Apollo Park. It was a week later, it was at Apollo Park. I think
Well, not far at all. Yeah.
So, anyway, I'll tell you the story.
Well, now that we just talked about it here, I might hear about it in my office.
It's very conceivable.
Come on.
Players all
And I
in.
make it so.
Did you see the small stretched lips expression in there? It was a quick one, almost what some people would call a micro-expression. Let's watch it again. It was just a split-second stretching of his lips. Though this is subjective to say, I think such a quick flash of the stretched out lips seems very uncertain and worried, even more so than a steady expression would be. Although it's unlikely in this specific hand, if Jeremy were considering value betting a vulnerable hand, it'd be unlikely he would want to actually convey his uncertainty. The uncertain expression in this spot makes a strong hand very likely. This next hand is from a $1,500 buy-in charity tournament. We'll be watching this player, Richard. We'll start on the flop. Keep an eye out for any stretched out lips at any point in the hand.
Check.
Jerry checks. Q barbecue checks.
Come on.
And Richard's going to make a bet of 4 1/4.
That's good for me, though. So. Isn't that what it's all about?
A few folds.
I call.
And Chad's going to make the call. A meaningless 5 of clubs on the turn. Our radio host continues his line, representing a king. And Chad, a non-believer, makes the call. A jack of diamonds on the river. Richard just made trips. Of course, nobody knows that he just 2-outed Chad. And, of course, he's going to bet.
Did you notice Richard had some stretched lips behavior betting the turn? His hand wasn't that strong, but it also wasn't weak. He likely believed he was ahead. Richard is actually a player who I've seen make a good amount of lip movements in different spots, both with strong and weak hands. Still, the pattern will usually apply to him. His behavior would just make it a bit less reliable overall. Did you also notice the stretched out lips on the river as he bets the set? Let's watch that again. This was similar to his facial expression when betting the turn, but let's compare them more closely. Here's a side-by-side comparison, with a bet with the set on the right. You can see his lips were more stretched out side to side when betting with the set. This is what I mean by the more extreme and more worried-looking expressions being more likely to indicate strong hands. The more ambiguous and more neutral the stretched lips seem, the less likely they are to be reliable information. Okay, let's look at some pre-flop examples. Generally, these won't be as meaningful just because the bets are smaller and hand strength is less defined. This next hand is from a 1-2 cash game. We'll be watching this player, Dan B., who has pocket aces. Watch his lips as he announces his raise.
Got this straight, I had bottom set, but I was just pissed at myself for
Calls
agreeing
11
to own
from 10.
because I suck at it. So, I mean, I wasn't throwing dead when the money went in, but I admittedly just suck at Omaha so bad.
Raise from Dan. 42.
As with most behaviors, pre-flop situations won't mean as much just because hand strength is more ambiguous in general. Still, the fact that he's 3-betting makes it a more significant spot, and it becomes more likely the behavior is meaningful, even if it's less meaningful than it would be when seen accompanying a river bet. This next hand is from a tournament. This player, Richard, has pocket queens. We'll watch for a quick flash of the expression before he raises.
At Chicago, Jason.
Call.
Thank you, sir.
No problem. The little guy's home
Raise.
technology is where.
Again, it's pre-flop, so this won't generally be as meaningful as post-flop instances. But if you were on the fence between folding and entering the hand, this behavior might encourage you to just fold. Let's watch a hand from the 2015 World Series of Poker main event. We'll be watching this player, Neil Blumenfield, who eventually went on to make the final table and get third place. In this hand he has pocket aces. We'll be watching for the stretched out lips expression after his raise is called.
A big blind.
De Silva graduated from the University of Houston with a degree in history. I believe he studied the history of loose aggressive play at the poker table.
Yeah, he didn't build that chip stack by holding big pocket pairs for 5 days. It takes moxie.
Again, it's unlikely a player would want to wear this expression if he were actually vulnerable. I actually analyzed that year's WSOP main event very closely because I was working for one of the final table players. I only saw the stretched out lips expression a couple times from Neil during a hand, and both times were when he had a very strong hand pre-flop. This example is a little different from the other examples we've looked at, because this behavior happens not before or after a bet, but after the bet is called. But it'll likely still be meaningful, assuming the player continues betting, because players with weak hands who are planning on continuing to bet or bluff generally won't want to make this face. So the important aspect is whether a player continues to bet after making this face. This next hand is from a tournament. We'll be watching this player, Richard, again in this one. Richard raised the flop with ace high, and we'll watch as he fires the turn. After his turn bet is called, be on the lookout for some agitated behavior, including some mouth movement.
Meaningless deuce of hearts on the turn, and Chris decides to tread lightly. Richard reaching for chips again, fires again, makes it 5,500. It's a tough spot for Chris here against Roper with an overcard to his pair on the board. He knows Richard could have a hand like ace-jack, but he's trying to figure out what other hands he could hold, and certainly the 2003 World Series of Poker champ has been the victim of many attempted bluffs in his career.
55.
And Chris calls again. The pot has ballooned to almost 28,000, and Richard looking pretty uncomfortable.
After his opponent calls, Richard moves around and has a lot of facial movement, including some stretched out lips and some licking of lips. On the river, Richard checks back immediately and gives up on the bluff. This is again another example of behavior that comes after a bet is called, and not immediately associated with a bet. This is similar to the spot we looked at earlier where Neil Blumenfield raised with pocket aces, was called, and had the stretched out lips expression. In this spot, in the moment, if I were Richard's opponent, it'd be very hard to determine whether this was genuine agitation with a weak hand or feigned agitation with a strong hand. It could probably go either way. But the important information would be whether or not Richard continued to bet after acting this way. What I mean is, if we didn't know Richard's hole cards and he bet the river after acting this way on the turn, he'd be likely to have a strong hand. This is because if he were considering bluffing the river, he'd be likely to remain stoic and be less likely to make such facial expressions. In this case, it's likely Richard's agitated reaction stems from a release of anxiety. It's likely after he's called on the turn, he's decided he's done with the hand and he's done with bluffing, so it doesn't matter how he acts. Let's summarize the practical use of spotting this behavior. In general, the practical benefit of spotting this behavior from a bettor or raiser will be that it will help you fold to players with strong hands. If you are on the fence about whether to call or fold, spotting this behavior can help you make up your mind. Or if you think that the pattern is very reliable for a specific player, this behavior might really sway your decision and make a fold very easy for you. Let's look at some caveats and warnings. The major caveat for this pattern is that some people have a lot of mouth and lip movements in a lot of different spots, whether strong or weak. For players like that, you have to remember that about them and be less likely to base a decision on the stretched lips expression. Again, to reiterate, the pattern will be most reliable when it's seen from players who are generally fairly stoic and don't usually have a lot of mouth movements or other kind of movements. As with all tells, this tell will be most reliable when you've observed a player for a little while and have an idea of their general mannerisms and whether the pattern is likely to hold true for them. That's it for this video.